Welcome, brave listeners, to Tales Not for the Faint of Heart. If you ever consider writing the viola, keep these stories in mind. These are the stories of composers who wrote for the viola and never lived to write again. It was 1945. Bela Bartók was dying of leukemia, but one piece still haunted him, a viola concerto commissioned by the famous William Primrose. He barely finished sketching it out before the shadows took him. The concerto was left behind, fragmented like the pieces of his soul. His loyal servant, Tibor Surly, resurrected it, but some say that Bartók's soul still lingers in that awkward in-between. So in 1944, William Primrose, a very famous violist, came to Bartók with a request for a viola concerto. Despite the fact that Bartók was suffering from leukemia and not doing very well, he needed the money, so he accepted the request. Primrose wanted to elevate the viola's status to a solo instrument just like the violin. So even though Bartók was more comfortable with the violin and knew it better, he tried to write for viola as well. He began working on the concerto in 1945 alongside his third piano concerto, which he wrote and finished as a gift for his wife. But his health quickly deteriorated, and when he died, his viola concerto was about 13 pages of sketches, so the viola solo lines with a couple notes on orchestration and form, but basically nothing else. Bartók had considered this a more or less ready draft, but no one other than him could really know how it was supposed to go. Like, the ideas were in his head, not so much on the page. One of his former students, Tibor Surly, ended up taking these fragments and making them into a 3-movement concerto, the one that we pretty much know today. I would say up until now, most people have performed this Surly edition of the Bartók concerto, but there have actually been a few other additions or endings to the concerto. So Peter Bartók, the composer's son, actually worked with a musicologist to try to finish the concerto from the original sketches. He felt that Surly sort of wrote the orchestration in his own style and not so much in Bartók's. So his son's version tries to be more like Bela Bartók's. This is a published edition by Boosey and Hawkes, so I have started to see this one performed and recorded a lot more recently. This edition was made in 1995, so 50 years after the composer's passing. In that same year, a Hungarian-born violist by the name of Csaba Erdélyi got to look at the original manuscripts, and he created his own reorchestration. So the solo part is essentially the same, but he thinned out the orchestrations to more of what he thought Bartók would have actually done in his day. Erdélyi was the first violist who actually got to take a look at the original sketches. Then in the early 2000s, musicologist Donald Maurice made his own reconstruction. He did a lot of research and looked at it more from a musicologist point of view, and really tried to reconstruct this with performance notes in his edition. This one is the most different from the others. So the Bartók Viola Concerto is kind of just this enigma that was never finished and could have gone a variety of different ways, and we've kind of seen a lot of those different possibilities now with all of these different editions. And I mean, if we're talking about scary stories, this viola concerto is a good one because I was scared the whole time I was learning it. I don't know about you, but that is quite a piece. The great Dmitri Shostakovich, frail and failing, wrote his viola sonata in 1975. They say he died writing this piece, which quotes Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Franz Liszt described the melody as a night scene with distant funeral bells. Did Shostakovich know the end was near, as he wrote Morendo at the end of every movement? His very last notes were for none other than the viola. So Shostakovich is one of my favorite composers. He lived in the 20th century in the Soviet Union during Stalin's rule. His life is very interesting to read and learn about. If you don't know much about him, I recommend watching some documentaries. I've watched some great ones here on YouTube about his life and how he was able to use music kind of to show his political stance or not. or help his cause or hurt his cause. It's very interesting, and I really recommend learning more about him and his music. But the last piece that he wrote was his Sonata for viola and piano. This is usually seen as basically his farewell piece, and he did say that he saw this piece as his own requiem. It's 3 movements long, and each of them ends with the direction morendo, which means to die away. Very fitting for his last piece. He wrote this almost a month before he passed, and he was able to turn in the draft, do a couple little edits and revisions, but he did not live to see it published. The 3rd movement quotes Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and he did say that he was trying to kind of memorialize Beethoven with this. Now, Moonlight Sonata was not, as far as we know, written about death or, with dying as a main theme, but over the years it's definitely become something that people think about when they listen to the music, and it dates as far back as Franz Liszt. The history is a little bit unclear if Liszt actually said this quote or not, but the quote that's usually attributed to him is, "The first movement of Moonlight Sonata is like a boat passing by in the moonlight, seen through tears. One hears the tolling of a distant funeral bell." So even during Shostakovich's time, a lot of people were probably thinking about death and things to do with that while listening to Moonlight Sonata. And so I find it really interesting that he chose to quote that in his last piece, as he probably knew that his time was coming. The aging Ernest Bloch was working on another viola sonata when his time ran out. The sketches stopped mid-phrase as if the ink died with his last breath. The leftover pieces are studied like sacred relics. Bloch had already written a few pieces for viola already when he went to write another suite for viola in the last year that he lived. He was in Oregon at the time, and all that he was able to write of this suite was the first movement with a couple little sketches of the other 3 movements. There's no finished version done by anyone. Some people have looked at it, but no one has completed their own kind of reconstruction like they did with the Bartók Concerto. So all we have is that first movement, and there are recordings of it, so you can go listen to it. It's just the rest of those are only sketches, so those aren't really played. Max Reger wrote 3 suites for solo viola in 1915, but a year later, he was gone. Some say the suites were a farewell. Others think it was a prophecy. Max Reger was a German composer who lived in the late 1800s to early 1900s, and his last composition for strings was the 3 suites for viola. These were fashioned after Bach's unaccompanied suites, which are also usually played on the viola, the unaccompanied cello suites, and the violin sonatas and partitas as well. About a year after Reger wrote these 3 viola suites, which are beautiful, by the way, definitely go listen to them, or if you're a violist, go learn them. They're really great. About a year after he wrote these, he died from a heart attack when he was just 43. So it was a very untimely early death for him. Tora Takemitsu, a lover of poetry, wrote a musical adaptation of A Bird Came Down the Walk for viola and piano in 1995. A year later, he joined those birds in flight. His memorial to Messiaen and John Cage turned into his own elegy. Toru Takemitsu wrote A Bird Came Down the Walk for viola and piano in 1994 for Nobuko Imai, a very famous violist. It's based on a poem by the same name by Emily Dickinson, and he used Japanese influences, Western tonality, impressionism, and even some literary influences like haiku and poetry for this very interesting composition. It's really, really cool. He ended up dying in February of 1996 from bladder cancer, and A Bird Came Down the Walk was one of his last chamber works. So if you ever find yourself writing a viola piece, ask yourself, are you feeling lucky? Or is the alto clef calling to you?